So hello everyone. Get started. Welcome to my session on migration to our new standard and essentials, SBS standard and essentials. My name is Bodhi Deb. I'm a program manager in the engineering team with the small business server team. I worked for about 5 years with that team, releasing both the SBS 2008 and the two product lines, SBS 2011 standard and essentials. So why am I presenting on migration today? So by the way, before I start, how many people think migration is complicated and scared of migration? I'm one of them. I did a lot of migrations last year, and I do not want to be in that boat. Like the number of things you can get wrong with migration, the number of things things changes during. It's just a complicated. It's a huge problem space, and it's quite complicated. More so because SBS is a packaged product. We do a lot of things to actually simplify the management and usability for small businesses, but that also means that we also limit some of the features of Windows Server. By the way, before I start, this session does assume that you are slightly familiar with the two versions of the product. How many people know about essentials and standard? So most of you actually know what the products are, so that's great. So what I'm going to talk about today is migration strategy for SBS, like what Microsoft recommends, how we want to approach migration, what are the key steps, key consideration, key strategies you need to plan when you're migrating to the new version of SBS. I'm going to talk a little bit about virtualization strategies and deployment strategies relating to virtualization. I'm seeing that quite a lot in the small business space as well. Line of business apps, and finally I'll deep dive into the actual migration process that we recommend for both standard and essentials. So migration strategy for SBS. So when we looked at our space, one of the key challenges which small business owners face is during a deployment or during a migration. For small businesses, any downtime, and they're like our typical businesses are from 5 to 10 seats. Any downtime, even a half a day downtime, results in loss of productivity, loss of revenue for them. So when we actually designed the migration for SBS, our goal was to have minimal downtime for end users. It makes the actual migration of the server slightly more complicated, but if everything goes well, the end users who are working mostly on their client PCs will have very little downtime when the server is switched over. There is one caveat. So we basically do a side-by-side migration of the server. We bring up a domain controller in the SBS network. We migrate the domain, we migrate the settings, and switch over, and finally demote the source server. One caveat is the server name actually changes during the migration. Now, sometimes this is important because client PCs actually access shared folders or docs right out of the server. So if they're pointing to the server using UNC paths and things like that, those things changes, as those things might need to be done manually. The supported parts, and what I mean by this is we actually came up with pretty detailed white papers on migration. So the white papers clearly talk step by step on what needs to be done on the source server, what needs to be done on the destination server. So very detailed. They come with a set of tools which allow you to do migration. Now, these are the published white papers from Microsoft. The two parts we have are SBS for SBS standard. migrating from SBS 2003, SBS 2008, and we also included SBS 2011 standard. That's a migration in that same version. So that's when you what you'll use to migrate to a new hardware, or if you're upgrading the hardware. So that's what you will use. For Essentials, we have the two parts, SBS 2003 and from SBS 2003 and to SBS 2011. Now let me give you a brief idea of why these priorities are. So we have about 1.2 million SBS 2003 units in the market today worldwide. It's a big number. Most people actually skipped deploying SBS 2008. It's the same recession, the Vista, the typical OS version skip which go through. So what we anticipate is there's going to be a huge migration, especially from folks who are using SBS 2003, Windows Server 2003, to the new version, R2-based versions of SBS 2011. So that's why we prioritize some of our migration white papers on those. The thing to note is they use basic Windows Server tools, and underneath they are basically, it's Windows Server Standard, and the destination is Windows Server 2008 R2. So the principles basically apply to any of the other Windows Server products as well. But in terms of the white paper we publish, these are the white papers that are actually currently there. All right. So migration, as I said, it's a lengthy, complicated process. When I first looked at the migration white paper, especially for standard, it's like 100 pages long. I didn't know where to begin. I didn't know where I was going to get stuck, where things could go wrong. It's a complicated product with Exchange, SharePoint, the domain controller being on the same server, DHCP being on the same server, WSUS being on the same server. So whenever I'm faced with a problem, I try to break it down. And when I actually looked at what the migration strategy we should have, there are, it may be a 100-page document, but there are these 4 very important, distinct phases of migration. And I want us all to think about these 4 distinct phases, because each of them are unique. Each of them, you need to take care of very specific issues during each phase, and each phase needs to be completed so that the migration is actually successful. And this, thinking about the 4 phases will also actually help you plan both strategically and tactically how long each phase is going to take, so that I know some of you actually help customers with migration to actually plan that this is going to take about 20 hours or 16 hours, depending on the size of data, depending on the complexity of migration, those things. And tactically, if there are problems during migration, tactically go and find solutions for them. So the phase 1 is mainly preparation. Here we're not even getting into where we are migrating to. It's all about the source. Now quick, in terms of how I define the source server, is where you are migrating from. This assumes that there is a source Windows server running a domain controller in that environment. I'm trying to move that server to SBS Standard or Essentials. Now these 4 distinct phases work both for Essentials and Standard. I'm going to do a deep dive on what the differences are, but basically the strategy is like, so what you do is you basically want to prepare the source server. You want to make sure this is the phase where you do all your planning. You want to make sure your source server is clean, all the updates are there, all the service packs, everything is set up in the way to be completely prepared for when you bring in the destination server into the network and start the migration. The second step, and it's important to, and as I said, it's important to take care of this step because you want your initial environment to be as clean as possible. The second step is installing the destination server in migration mode. If you're familiar with SBS, SBS is because of the way it is designed, SBS is always the root of the forest in the domain. It is the primary domain controller, always has the FSMO roles and is the global catalog server. So it is, if you, in any other way, it is impossible to actually install SBS in an existing domain, except when you do it in a migration mode. And we allow you 21 days for 2 SBS servers to exist side by side in the domain. And this is important because if you do not install the and I'm going to talk about how to actually install the server in a destination server in migration mode. But it's extremely important that this happens. So what happens in this phase? You bring up the second server in the domain. You make the first step you do is you DC promo the destination server, and it becomes a replica DC in that domain. At that point, you want to migrate the domain controller from the source server as a primary domain controller into the destination server. So the destination server at that point becomes the transfer the FSMO roles, global catalog server, site licensing server. All those are done during this phase. Now, it's very important, again, in this phase to make sure that this step happened well, because at this time, the Active Directory DS is actually replicating on both servers. So you have to ensure that all the replication happened. You have to ensure that this happened cleanly. There are no event loggers. I'm going to talk about the troubleshooting in these steps as well, but you have to make sure that this step actually happened before you advance to the next step. So this, once you get the destination server in the domain controller, when SBS is there in the network, it only allows you, we allow you to run it side by side for 21 days. And that's because of the way, as I mentioned, SBS is designed. It has to be the root of the forest. And this starts the countdown of those 21 days. You'll see an event log in your event viewer every night that the countdown has started. After the 21-day period expires, your server will actually start shutting down every hour. It's very, very critical to actually complete the entire migration within this time. The third phase is now the two servers are running side by side, so things are fine. The two domain controllers, users. By the way, if you know that no users or client PCs are affected at all, they are still logging into their domain credentials. They're still logging into they're accessing all the resources on the network. So at this time, you want to migrate after you've made sure that all the the domain controller is actually running healthy. You want to migrate the settings and the data. For standard, it means SharePoint, Exchange, WSUS, any documents and folders, any shared documents and folders, things like that. And again, need to make sure that all the data is actually transferred during phase. Data is probably the most critical part of any business, and you want to make sure that before you go to the next phase, everything has been transferred properly. And this is why we give you the 21 days that allows you to do the transfer. Final step, again, extremely critical, demoting and removing the source server. Now, at this time, all this while the two source server are running, two servers are running side by side. So it's extremely critical to cleanly remove the source server. So you want to remove uninstall Exchange, you want to remove it as a domain controller, and you finally DC promo down the source server. Finally, you get the settings. I'm going to talk in more depth what these steps imply. But before I do that, I want to address some of the high-level questions I've seen while I was in the booth and in general. I'm seeing a lot of interest in deploying SBS in virtualized environments, and this is actually quite a good way to deploy SBS, and there are various ways you can do that. Now, SBS, both 2011 standard and essentials, can be deployed both as a physical server or as a virtual server. It is important to note that SBS itself cannot be the Hyper-V host. However, if you guys are aware that there is a premium add-on with both essentials and standard. It comes with a second copy of SBS, second copy of Windows Server Standard R2. You can use that as the host and virtualize SBS on top of it, or you can use Windows Server Hyper-V, which just comes with the base Hyper-V and no other roles, and that is, by the way, free. Various virtualization methods I've seen. You can virtualize everything on the network, consolidate all servers in one single hardware. So I did one site last year. There were about 60 users. They were running 4 different servers on SBS 2003. So SBS 2003, the SQL running on a premium add-on, and another member server running terminal services, and one more running a line of business app they were using. Now, these 4 servers were generating a huge amount of heat, and I'm sure you guys have visited some of these server closets in small businesses. Huge amount of heat and energy. So we actually moved all of them to a single server like R710. So it does require a slightly high-end server, but their investment is actually paying off for them because they're seeing about 20% decrease in energy costs over long periods of time, just because they're running on a new server, which are anyway more energy efficient. Server 2008 R2 is more energy efficient. So you want to do this if you have several member servers. If you have like 3 or 4 member servers, you want to collect them together. Obviously, Hyper-V is easier to manage. On the flip side, you do need an additional copy of standard. You do need a higher-end hardware, and you need more planning on how to do data protection, backup, and things like that on the host server. The other thing I've seen is using the second server, as I mentioned, second server as with the premium add-on. You can turn on the Hyper-V role on that Windows Server 2008 R2, and you can virtualize SBS on top of it. This is, by the way, the cheapest way to get another copy of standard. So even if you don't need the premium add-on, putting together, I'll address that question.
SQL, that's good, but if you don't need SQL,
I agree. So the two things I've noticed how people use this. So by the way, one of the biggest problems in the small business space and still in much of the market is a lot of line-up businesses which small businesses use. They're still 32-bit based. They're not going to be moving to 64-bit anytime soon. So rather than actually the hardware is dying, they're probably 5 or 6 years old, rather than actually still keeping, buying another piece of hardware, you just virtualize the standard 2003 server and host your line of business apps on that. Again, as I mentioned, another big problem in our area, and the reason I'm talking about this, our migration document does not cover a lot of about migrating the line of business app, which is very, very critical to small businesses. They get a lot of benefit out of email, but it's their daily activity, either the accounting package or the specific line of business specific to that industry. So couple of things to ask yourself and the customer: is x64-bit supported? So this could be a really good opportunity to have the customer upgrade to the x64-bit. You have to find out what is the migration or upgrade path for that particular line of business app in that environment. Or, as I mentioned, you can host it. If it's not there, you can use virtualization to actually host that. Again, another question we get asked very often. So SBS Essentials, as you know, is think about it, it's a stripped down version of our standard product. It does not have Exchange. It does not have SharePoint. We actually designed this for the smaller SMBs, 1 to 15, 10 to 15, where they already have email solutions. They basically need the server for some productivity apps like remote access, backup, and things like that. So our migration doc, again, does not cover to a large detail if you were to migrate from SBS 2003 and they are using Exchange as their email, how to migrate them to a hosted solution. So current solutions from Microsoft include BPOS and hosted Exchange. There are migration paths to actually move your hosted, your on-premise email to the cloud. But our eventual goal is to have close integration with Office 365 when it is available. So more information is coming on that soon. I got a lot of questions in the booth about this. Just wanted to make sure everybody, it's coming soon. Wait for a couple of months. We'll have a really good story about how to migrate some of your SBS 2003 customers. So with that, I'm going to deep dive into what I talked about, the 4 phases. I'm going to talk more deeply about what each of these phases you actually do in this during the migration. So SBS Standard is a packaged product with Exchange SharePoint. The migration path I'm going to focus on is migrating from SBS 2003 or SBS 2008 to SBS 2011. It assumes that you are migrating your Exchange server, you're migrating your SharePoint repository, and but as I said, it does not. We're using Windows Server tools, so they should work. They absolutely work for standard setups as well. So for SBS 2011 standard, we actually built a migration wizard, and it is launched from the destination server. It's a wizard-based step-by-step guide to the migration. It includes both manual and some steps are actually automated. It should be used with the migration white paper. So the way I usually do that is I'm running the migration wizard, but I actually have the printout of the migration white paper side by side so that I can go back and forth on that. And again, the wizard can be completed in 21 days. The reason I bring this up, the migration wizard is only available in migrating SBS standard. It's not available for essentials. Why the 21-day limit? I'll take the questions at the end if you can keep that. So the preparation phase, talked a lot about that. You really want your source network to be as clean as possible. So we do assume a specific network configuration. As I mentioned, we're assuming migrating from SBS 2003 or 2008 to standard. Your source server must be set up with a single NIC behind a router. The reason this is important is a lot of SBS 2003 setups were done with behind ISA as the gateway. So you need to change that. You need to move that to a setup where it is behind a router. It's just easier to manage. You want to install all service packs and updates. And it's amazing. Every time I go to a customer and start a migration, I spend at least half a day or close to a day doing updates and patches. It's amazing how people, customers, when they are not well managed with a partner, that they actually do not do some of this. You want to do all that. There is a BPA tool, the best practices analyzer that comes with SBS 2003, 2008, and 2011. You want to run that BPA tool, and it's important, fix all errors and warnings. Now, not all of them will be important, but you cannot go wrong with, you will be more clean or you'll be more healthy than required, so there is no downside to fixing all the errors and warnings. It's, again, the number of times I've seen where people have ignored some of the warnings and the errors, thinking, how is this going to impact my migration? And later on in the migration, when you get to a phase where you cannot get back, we make some irreversible changes that said, oh, did you actually do this step when we asked you to? So very, very important to do fix every error on the errors and warnings on BPA. The BPA keeps getting updated with new rules as we learn more about issues, so it's always important to download the latest version of BPA when you run that. We have when moving to 2011, there is an exchange readiness tool that's actually also very useful. It looks at a huge number of parameters on both Exchange 2003 and 2008 to make sure that you can actually migrate to 2011. So that's another tool you should run. The migration preparation tool, this is another tool, comes with SBS. If you're moving from SBS 2003, it basically raises the functional level of AD Directory Services 2003 so that you can do the AD replication, and also runs add prep 32 to extend the AD schema for SBS 2011. This is required because we actually extended the schema when we moved to 2011. Next step, backing up your source server. Extremely, extremely important. As I mentioned, we will be making some irreversible changes during the process. Sometimes it's almost impossible to go back, and this is going to this is a nasty and a cumbersome way, but please back up your server. The last step, which has kind of helped me quite a lot, is doing a test migration. So if you have a Hyper-V setup, if you have a isolated setup somewhere, take a copy of the source servers and try and do a test migration. So what the BPA, exchange readiness, and tools and all these things do is they can find out individual issues with updates or specific settings in the registry. What it does not do is how this impacts when all the systems are interacting with each other. Test migration actually sometimes reveals some of the other problems that can happen, and if you have time and the resources, this is actually a very useful tool because you're going to save a lot of time in dealing with issues which can come during an actual production migration. Some of the other optional tasks you could and probably should do: cleaning up the network, reducing size of data, exchange mailboxes. If it will, when Exchange, we're moving the mailboxes from the source to the destination, it will move the mailboxes over the network. and the time it takes to move is completely dependent on the size of your data. So you want to make sure that people have deleted their, cleaned up their deleted folders, all the unused users and computers are removed from the AD, so as clean as possible. Collect all the usernames and passwords for other services you might be using, and decide if you want to virtualize your server. So if you want to virtualize your server, you want to create that setup at this point. So far, we haven't brought in the destination server yet. So this is the first time and take as much time in preparation as possible. Saves a lot of unbillable hours for some of our partners. Installing the destination server in migration mode. As I mentioned, SBS is the root of the forest. It's the primary domain controller. You cannot have two SBS servers in the same network, except in the migration mode. The way we special case this is create an answer file tool, create an answer file with the answer file tool. So during setup, our setup process, the initial configuration process, looks for this specific key in the answer file tool. And it's actually a very simple one. It just looks for migration equal to true or not. When that happens, we do a special case where we allow two SBS servers to be running side by side. Now, this is basically why the 21-day limit is. We allow this to happen for only 21 days because two SBS servers running side by side, we cannot let that happen forever. So 21 day we thought was a good enough time for people to migrate all the data and the services and everything, and that's the grace period. Just FYI, if you are migrating from Windows Server Standard or migrating to Windows Server Standard, the 21-day period actually does not apply because then you have only one SBS in the network, and that two DCs can be in the same network for as long as possible. So once you've created the answer file and running initial config, so it looks for that particular key in that folder. It has to be in the root of any directory on the destination server, and the installation does the following things. It installs the server and adds itself to the existing domain, and all this is automatic, by the way. The FSMO roles from the source server are transferred to the destination server. The destination server becomes your global catalog server. It becomes a site license server, and by the way, SBS Standard is a DHCP server as well. So it moves the DHCP from the source to the destination. So all these steps happen at this time. The replication of the AD also happens during time, and it is one of the key things to note during this phase. You see a lot of problems when replicating from the source and the destination, and we encourage people to use some of the Windows Server tools such as DCDiag, repadmin, netdiag to make sure that the domain controller is in a healthy state. I'll try and take the questions. If you can keep them, I'll try and take the questions towards the end. Thank you. Settings and data. SBS Standard is your SMTP Exchange server is the SMTP address on the network. So one of the things before we start moving Exchange server is to migrate all the internet settings to the destination servers. There is a wizard. There's a wizard you run, and it takes you through 3 steps, and it moves everything to the destination server. If there are specific router rules or DHCP reservations, you want to take care of that outside of this. The next step is moving the Exchange server public folders, mailboxes, and the Outlook address books. we use Exchange tools to actually do the migration. Again, what I usually do is first day I come to this step. It usually takes, prepare. As I said, most of the time when I go into a network, it's spend a huge amount of time doing updates and things like that. So come to this step. I let the mailboxes migration run overnight, and depending on the size, they complete overnight or not. So that's one of the things you could do when you're planning for how many days.
Quick question.
Okay, I'll take
Mailbox
this.
sizes.
Yeah.
Will you run problems if the destination server has smaller sizes than you need to
Yes.
think about?
Good question. So I think by default the destination server, and I'm forgetting what the default settings is 2 gigabytes. And and I've seen that in some settings where SBS 2003 was or 2008 was set up with a bigger mailbox. You want to just quickly go and change the default settings before you want to move. That's actually we say that in the migration document in the details of what needs to happen. Copying data is we use a simple robocopy command to actually copy the data over. You want to recreate all the shares on the destination server. You want to recreate any specific permissions or policies you have for the destination. So everything will work because it's both the servers are in the same domain, and the same domain credentials will still work. But the actual copy of the data is using robocopy. The command we have in the migration document is actually an incremental command. And the way I personally do it is I run the robocopy overnight. So it creates kind of a snapshot of whatever the data is. And I do the robocopy command a couple of times during the migration. And towards the end, when I see fewer and fewer changes with the data, because all this time the users are making changes, they're copying files into the shares, they're doing they're adding files, removing files, they're doing all of that. Finally, when I see the changes are very small, that's when I say, okay, I'm going to shut down the source server, all the shares, and do a final move, and then switch that over. So that's what I initially meant when I said minimal downtime. It's not zero downtime, but the goal is to actually reduce that to something which is acceptable for the customer. Moving SharePoint, and I think one of you had a question about moving SharePoint. Again, slightly complicated task if you're moving from SBS 2003, mainly because the first step is, even before you migrate over to 2011, the first step is actually upgrading SharePoint on the SBS 2003 box to SharePoint 3.0 with SP2. And this is a limitation with SharePoint that if you want to migrate to SharePoint Foundation 2010, the migration path supported is only 3.0 with SP2. So the first step you need to do is upgrade that. Again, most of the time, if I follow the steps, it works fine. The typical issues I see in this step are with credentials. Making sure the account you're using to actually transfer has all the credentials required. We have a very detailed description of what those policies should be or what those credentials should be. But again, those are the things, if you miss out one of the steps, it could lead to a problem later when you're actually migrating the data. The last few steps, if they're using fax, you want to move the fax data and set it up. Update services, you want to move that to the destination server so that starts becoming that starts doing all the WSUS management within the network. Users and groups, this is actually a step that's required so that it actually starts showing up, users and groups start showing up in the console. Other than that, there is no other use to moving users and groups. It allows you to use the tools we have with the SBS console. Otherwise, your Active Directory is underneath is all the same. You have all the users, you have all the domain, you have last step, demoting and removing the source server. Very, very critical to remove Exchange server. Lot of support calls come to Microsoft where people, they've moved data, they've moved everything, and they've just shut down the old server, thinking that it's done. And it's an obvious, it's a natural thing. When I'm migrating a laptop or something, I don't need to go through a huge process to, uninstall the old laptop, and that's the thinking. But you are in a domain environment where Exchange, SharePoint, etc. are very, very tightly linked to the Active Directory. It is especially Exchange, extremely critical to uninstall Exchange cleanly. Lots of KB articles out there, lots of white papers on how to do this cleanly. Again, I've run into many issues in this step, and very few times I've actually seen issues which are repeated. Once again, once you're out of that 21-day limit, this step becomes more and more difficult because your server is shutting down every hour. And I've had to do that for one site where Exchange server uninstallation sometimes takes more than an hour, and between that your server is shut down. It's very, very important to do this within this 21 days, and important to leave, if you're planning to use the full 21 days, leave some buffer time in the end if you run into issues. Final step, DC promo down the source server. It removes the domain controller from the network. Everything is clean, the source server is gone. Then you can shut down the source server and repurpose it for anything you need. So Essentials also follows some of these steps. So I'm going to go into how to migrate to Essentials. There are some differences. And before we do that, one of the things I want to talk about is, should you migrate at all? SBS Essentials is targeted towards small businesses like 10 to 15 customers. You're not necessarily migrating Exchange and SharePoint. There's not, you don't have the complications of the source server which exists when you're migrating from standard to standard. Questions to ask yourself: how many users are computers? So a typical migration process will take you about 2 days with due diligence and everything. If the user, if you have very few users and computers, like 4 or 5, it just might be easier to install it fresh and recreate all the profiles, copy over the data. So you want to make sure which way you're going to spend more time. Sometimes I did a migration with just 4 users, and it was actually easier to do this way, because all we needed to do was migrate the profiles, and they were back up and running. The other advantage is if you're migrating from a really old Windows Server 2003 or standard or SBS, domain controllers become dirty. Like at that time, it has tons of stuff. Even if you cleaned it up, is it really worth migrating all that to the new 2010 domain controller? There are various advantages to starting from scratch and having everything clean. So one thing, something to consider when using our migration document. Again, very similar to how you do the standard. And I'm going to talk what the differences are. We do not have, for Essentials, we actually do not have the migration wizard. So some of these tasks are actually manual. You have to do, run the tools manually. I actually personally like the manual steps. I don't know about the others, but I actually personally like that because I can control each step. Like I run one step, if there are errors, I can look at it then and there, try and fix that. Sometimes what happens in automated steps is it goes through a few steps, tries to roll back to something before, and it fails, and then you're at a stage where you have to manually do the rollback. Again, backing up the source server. By the way, this assumes as you're kind of moving from SBS 2003 to standard. And once again, I think that's going to be a huge case. We have a million customer base. They're either going to move, half of them I think are going to move to either standard, or if they don't require email or SharePoint, they'll move to Essentials. Again, reduce size. So one thing important to note, Essentials now only supports up to 25 users or computers. When moving from SBS 2003, SBS 2003 supports up to 75 users or computers. So you want to make sure that they are in that limit. From what I've seen, most people are like, our customer base is within 10 to 15, so they never get into that legal issue. But what I have seen is this server existed for the last 7-8 years, and a lot of people came in, went out. People never deleted those users or computers, and now they have like 40 users or computers, which, before you migrate them, make sure they're under that 25. Installing in migration mode is again similar. You create an answer file, put it on the root of the destination server. Some of these steps which are actually automated for the standard are actually manual. Transferring the certificate authority, transferring the FSMO roles, global catalog server, reconfiguring DNS, and all these are manual steps. And as I said, I actually prefer this, because each of these steps, when I'm going through a command line tool, I can actually verify after each step if there were any problems with this step and deal with that right there. Migrating settings and data. This is actually more simpler than standard, because you're not migrating Exchange at this point. There's a couple of PowerShell scripts which you use to migrate some of the computers, users, and again, this is to allow users to show up on the console, the dashboard, so that you can use some of the tools on the dashboard to manage them. One of the interesting parts about Essentials is it comes with the client piece. The client piece does two things. It does health monitoring. It also does backup of the client PCs. So you need to go around the client PCs installing that connector. If you don't do, the only things that don't happen is backup and health monitoring. People will still be able to have access to the domain. Rest of the things, they're pretty similar for standard and Essentials. And the final step, again, very critical. I did one installation. We actually, the partner I was working with, we moved from SBS 2003 to 2011. And at that point, they were actually not using Exchange, because they'd already moved to a cloud solution. And the partner thought, why should not using Exchange, why do I need to do this? And we ran into a lot of problems. Again, if you're moving from SBS 2003, even if they're not using Exchange, it is critical to do a clean uninstall of Exchange. Troubleshooting and diagnosis, I talked a lot about through the process, but extra due diligence in every step. So once if you think of the 4 phases I talked about, after each phase, run some basic troubleshooting, use the tools to verify the health of DC, make sure that users are able to connect to the network, get to the resources. So very important to make sure that each step actually entered and exited cleanly. Very important to fix all the issues in BP. I talked about that. DC and AD replication, we see a lot of issues when that happens, especially from really old servers. Again, the one good way to check that is using DC diag. It kind of gives you a very comprehensive view of what the errors are, what's going on in the diag. And it's actually good to keep running DC diag from after each step and verifying the health of diag. Removal of Exchange, talked about that. Folder redirection, did not talk about that before, but again, another bane of my migration. If you we allowed folder redirection to be enabled on SBS 2003, SBS 2008. Now it's a group policy. It's a lazy group policy where you need at least a couple of logins before the group policy migrates over. Extremely critical if you want to set up or move the folder redirection group policy from the source to the destination, to make sure that before you have demoted the old server, all the group policies have actually applied on each of the client PCs. One way to do that is doing a GP update /force and doing a couple of log on log offs to actually ensure that has happened. I've seen a lot of sites where we migrated the group policy to the destination server, but not all folders were actually migrated. It's an automated task, but it's a lazy group policy. It takes time making sure that happens. For the last one, a lot of people miss out on that one as well. The SMTP settings, and this is on the client when you're connecting from Outlook to 2010. By default in SBS 2003, they're unauthenticated. So you actually have to go to Outlook properties and click that setting which says authenticate. And a lot of times after you migrate, you don't get the email flowing with your Outlook, and that's probably the reason. Couple of other methods of migration, and after this I'm going to kind of open it up to questions. So this is what I talked about is Microsoft's strategy of migration. There are other philosophies, there are other ways to migrate, and I encourage you to look at all of those. Notably, Jeff Middleton's swing migration, and you can have more information at sbsmigration.com. So the way that works is you use a temporary server to swing the Active Directory back to the new server, and then you finally move the settings and data. It allows you to do certain things, but it does have some downtime because you are shutting down the old server and moving it, getting the new server in. The other, one of the advantages, you actually save the same name, which to some sites is actually useful if they're using the UNC names, because then the clients don't need to go and change all the shortcuts and things like that. Resources. We have a new migration portal on TechNet. Encourage you to all go and check that out. It has links to all the migration. We have like 6 or 7 migration white papers. encourage you all to look at that. It will be a live updating site. So what usually happens is, as and when we get support calls, and depending on what are the most important support calls we're getting, we will be publishing KB articles, white papers, blogs. All those would be through this resources. We also have the official SBS blog. It talks about managing SBS in general and other issues, and they're cross-linked with each other. So if you want to go through that. Final one, SBS forums. A huge community of SBS users, partners, MVPs, usually extremely helpful. I have asked questions to them and got really good answers. So I encourage you to use the forums. Some community resources talked about Jeff Middleton's SBS migration. It is a paid service. You need to pay to subscribe to his migration white paper and his process. But he does have a huge amount of, he's been doing that for the last 15 years or something. So there's a huge knowledge base of not only migrating from SBS, but all other versions of standard, ISA, all the other complex situations you can face. Migrating client PCs, for instance. And a few other blogs you can get to. All right. So we have about 20 minutes, so questions. I'll take his because I asked him to wait. So.
Migrations in SBS 2008, there was a sort of undocumented restriction, maybe it was documented, but I never noticed it was a problem, that the source and destination servers really had to be on the same subnet.
Yes.
Is that still true?
So the question is, do the source and the destination server have to be in the same subnet? Yes, that is correct. It has to be in the same subnet for.
You should think about making workarounds for that because it was like a pre-deploy, but pre-prepare hardware often
Yeah.
in the shop before we roll it out to customers and do things. The ability to do that over a hub where there are different subnets is very helpful. You sort of make that impossible. We have to go on site.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good. Right now, our.
You want to stage this, you might imagine you have a scenario where you can stage it somewhere else. You just can't have it.
Yeah.
You're on site, that's a problem.
Yeah, right now the migration white paper assumes that you're on the same subnet, and that's why that preparation phase.
Have to just all work, right? You
Yeah.
can't even complete the migration.
Yeah.
Question, could you install, let it get a DHCP address, put it in, let it pick up an address and continue migration remotely?
The question is,
Install
if
the OS,
install the OS and.
and then ship it to the customer, let him plug it in, it'll pick up a DHCP address and continue the migration remotely.
You can't finish it, install the OS. It looks like the DHCP server at the time has been the same subnet.
Yeah.
So by far and away, our biggest pain point with 08 migrations is exactly the server name problem. We rename PCs. Why does SBS block us from being able to, when we're done with migration, bring the new server back and call it the same?
So the question is, why is there a limitation on the server name not remaining the same? So it is a side-by-side migration.
Sorry, you didn't get my question. I understand the side by side. I
Yeah.
understand during the migration we have to be different names. Once this machine is gone, why can't I rename this back to the original server?
Okay. The question is, why can't during migration you rename the server back to the original one? It's mainly because the server name is highly tied to when we do the DC promo. Requires a actually fully qualified server name. The Exchange server and all those pieces, actually the way our setup works assumes the server name. And it is, yeah, I agree, it is currently a limitation. And one of the things you could potentially think of, if server name is that important, look at SBS, the swing migration process, that might be one way to go.
Well, if that depended on the UNC, why don't you just do the DNS alias? There was an issue on 2008 with the DNS alias print shares. So you have to make a registry change. But we always use like a major corporation, the DNS alias for the print server, so whenever we change it, we don't have to go back to the workstations. And that's what we do.
Yeah. So I have done several things. For instance, where people are using shared resources either through not using it through UNC or through actually a mounted drive, just using a group policy to switch that over to the other server, and it just works fine. But yeah, if that could be a solution.
Migrating print server resources. You've got a clever strategy for dealing with print server issues.
Next question. Yeah.
We've done numerous I've done numerous migrations from SBS 03 to 08. Probably the most problems we've had, or I've had, is migrating over the public folder.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be more often than not you get some type of permission error when migrating the public folders in Exchange.
So.
More often than not, you can't just basically says you can't copy the folders over.
Yes, the question is there a better way to migrate the public folders? And I'm exactly not sure what the specific errors were. I've seen that error many times. Usually running some of the preparation tools, talked about the Exchange migration tool, BPA, reduces some of them. Even if you see warnings, just try and make sure all those are clean. But again, you cannot ensure that everything will be clean. And I have not seen a problem repeat twice. And the way to do that is when you see a problem, try to find a solution. And what we're trying to do is, if we see a specific problem repeat many times, we're going to come up with a solution on our SBS migration portal. And if this is something you're looking at and seeing very often, it's very likely that it's come to our support team, and we'll probably see some solution for that pretty soon. Yes?
I'm just wondering, so when you go through sort of the decommission stages of the 2003 server, you stripped Exchange off, DC chromed it out. At that point, you're sort of at a stage where it's almost a Windows 2003 server, just member server.
Yep.
If you have line of business applications that are 32-bit, could you just leave them on that server and let it run that way?
The question is, can the source server, after it has been DC promote, can it run as a member server? The answer is no. If the operating system underneath is server standard, but you are running SBS, so you will have to reinstall Windows standard on it, because as soon as it sees that itself as SBS, it will shut down, saying that there is another SBS server on the network, I cannot exist, even if it's not DC promote. Yeah.
You don't have a 2003 license essentially, right? You didn't necessarily put it back, but just not go that far with SBS on it. I mean, you already bought the SBS 2003 license, you're basically throwing it away at that point. So there's no way to really.
Yeah, it's correct. That's a limitation, and the main reason for that is we don't want SBS is cheaper than if you bought Exchange, SharePoint, all those things separately. If we allowed that, you could potentially use SBS in a farm, and so that's mainly the reason why, because we do provide a limited solution 0 to 75 users, and that's why we restrict that, and that is indeed a limitation. See it, somebody new, yeah.
These days, Dell and HP are going to be shipping tons of these. How, if you get a Dell box that already comes ready to go, they're going to have it so that it boots up and starts asking
Yep.
questions. Is it
question is, Dell comes pre-staged with a certain set of software, and when you bring that up, what we call as initial config starts, and will the migration tool work from that? The answer is yes, because the migration answer file is actually picked up during the initial config, which sets up the name of the server, the name of the domain, username, password. So the first stage where we call that staging, which is basically putting the image of the operating system into the hard drive, and which is the step Dell or HP would be shipping it in. So your migration answer file should still work.
You said that you didn't have the 21-day limit migrating to Windows 2010 standard.
Yes.
But if you do the FSM roles, the original server will shut down eventually.
So are you moving to standard, or are you
If
moving?
you're moving from 2003 SPS to 2008 R2 standard, you said you didn't have the 21-day limit, but you can't continue to run the SPS if you move the FSM roles to the server.
Okay, the question is, well, moving from SBS 2003 to standard, does the 21-day limit still work? Yeah, SBS 2003 to standard. I may have misquoted when I say that, but yes, you're correct. Because SBS has SBS cannot be in another domain. The 21-day, if your source server is SBS at any point of time, your source server will start counting down the 21 days as soon as you come in the migration mode. Yes?
Respond to your comment about public folder migration. We've seen it so many times. And the problem is not usually been a permission thing, although I've seen that once or twice. The usual problem is replication is right. Then you can't remove it, really, right? And that blocks you from completing it. And so there is a very complex procedure to dump that stuff in the ASIA. So our practice is give it a shot once. It doesn't take a reasonable amount of time, 20 or 90 or something like that, and just back up the stuff that the SCPs kill it or create it. So that's what we have some scenarios where I'm going to store.
So.
And I'm sure it's not right. So, but there's a small thing. This is often the case. It's just
Yeah, I mean, that's what we do too. I mean,
but it does require to clean up the old one. That is, it's probably documented somewhere, but it's not part of the basic plugin design.
So one quick, we are recording the session, so if you want to address here so that I can repeat it and have the individual discussions outside. Otherwise it'll look very weird with pauses in between.
What you said was that, this is a common problem, we're probably working on it. This has been a problem since the last generation. Right, like back on dozens of these migrations, multiple replications, always. It's probably 50% of the time. So is there you guys
Is there a yeah.
do it? Please just do it.
Yeah, the question is if there is new guidance. I'm pretty sure there is, because I actually ran into a similar issue, and I actually used a KB article which our support guys gave us and used it. I would, on top of my head, I don't know if there's a specific KB article which talks about that, but I have done migrations where I have faced that issue and gone to a Microsoft article which looks at that. And the 2010 exchange preparation tool is actually a new tool, and we've seen that to be very useful in finding out more issues than what the best practices and analyzer actually reveals.
Does it do something particularly intelligent about the replication? Because articles you refer to generally have to do with really troubleshooting replication.
Yes, yeah.
Really hard. Usually just isn't successful.
You mentioned that there was a possibility to migrate from Windows Server standard to SPS.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be supported where the server standard had an exchange on top of it in one box?
Yep.
That would be a supported solution as well. You mentioned, I just wanted some clarification, the 21-day limit doesn't apply in that scenario, is that correct?
No. So the question is, can we migrate from a standard setup, even if it's multiple servers, to SBS standard? So the basic steps remain the same. You bring up SBS in the destination SBS server, DC promo it, join the domain DC promo it, and once you migrate all the FSMO roles, global catalog, your SBS becomes the Yeah, you're right. The tool. Yes, yeah. The actual source tool would not run, but that is still the case for SBS standard. In SBS Essentials, all these steps are manual anyway. So that should be. Yeah, and that's why I was saying I actually prefer the manual steps, because once you've run ad prep once, you can run many times, and once you're familiar with that.
Server 2008 SBS comes with a fairly nice built-in backup feature with USB hard drives. Is there a way to use that full backup as an option to do the migration?
The question is.
You do the backup, you totally shut down your source server, effectively simulating a crash, bring up a brand new server with SBS, and then use this backup as a way to restore.
The question is, can we use the backup feature to do a migration SBS 2008 onwards? Interestingly, we actually considered this once. And the way we thought about this is, there is a very nice system state backup and restore. Unfortunately, it does not work very well when there is a new fresh domain. The system state backup and restore only works if your AD is exactly the same. So you could do a restore in that session, and we tried some of this, and we actually stopped that strategy after a while, because there were no clear paths to do. When you had the new server, there were no clear paths to migrate the Active Directory domain. The data was easier because it's just copying over some of the.
That would be ideal.
Well, that's what I've been hoping for ever since I heard about going from 03 to 08, at one of your previous meetings, is that we'd be able to have let's not say SBS backup, but let's say a tool, a CD we could run on the server, throw out a special backup that looks at all the content of Active Directory, all the content of SharePoint, all the content of Exchange, just takes all the data, moves it over to a full backup of source. Let's not call it a backup. Let's call it an export. And then when you create a new 11 or SBS 2020, we can take that and just drop it and let the operating system recover those pieces that it needs, put them back on the server, power up, you're done.
Yeah, these are some of the things we thought about. Some of it is actually limited by the migration strategies of Exchange, for instance, and obviously some of the resources we have. Like, do we actually invest in building a completely new tool, or we actually use some of the existing tools of? No, I know what you're talking about. It's a good feedback. Yeah.
On the end game, which is force us to take away the old server.
Yeah.
Understandable. Okay, I don't mind if at some point during that migration you say, okay, now that I'm done over here, plug in the old server. When it sees it, it kills it. I don't care. But we are technically doing a side-by-side install.
Yes.
To upgrade to the hardware. We might as well just have something clean to take us.
That's true, yeah. So I'll take one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. I'll be here for a little while if you want to talk to me personally. All right, then. Thank you, everyone.